Netflix just dropped Monster, the Ed Gein Story, the third chapter in Ryan Murphy's true crime anthology that already gave us Dahmer and the Menendez brothers. And once again, it's everywhere. Memes, clips, debates. But the question that keeps coming up is simple. How much of this is true? Welcome to Behind the Crime Scene. Make sure to subscribe and like if it makes sense for you, because tonight we're pulling back the curtain to see where fact ends and where the legend of Ed Gein begins. Let's start with the truth, the real man behind the myth. Plainfield, Wisconsin, a small Midwestern farming town where winters are long and quiet and everyone knows everyone. On the edge of town stood a lonely farmhouse, collapsing under its own dust. That's where Ed Gein lived, a shy handyman who fixed fences, ran errands, even babysat for neighbors. To most people, he seemed harmless, but under that calm surface, something was breaking. Ed Gein was born in 1906 to George and Augusta Gein. George drank too much. Augusta prayed too much. She ruled her two boys with fear and the Bible, teaching them that women were sinful and that the world was doomed by immorality. She forbade friends, isolated them from everyone, and filled their minds with guilt and shame. Experts later said Ed didn't just love his mother, he worshipped her. She was his teacher, his protector, and his obsession. When Ed was 34, his father died. 4 years later, his older brother Henry died in a fire under suspicious circumstances. Police ruled it an accident, but some wondered if Ed's hand was in it. No proof ever surfaced. Then, in 1945, Augusta suffered 2 strokes and died. For Ed, that was the end of everything good in his world. He boarded up her bedroom, leaving it perfectly preserved, and lived in the rest of the farmhouse, which slowly turned into a decaying tomb. He began reading pulp horror magazines, anatomy books, and war-era medical experiments. He became fascinated by death and what lay beneath the skin. That's when things grew darker. By the early 1950s, women around Plainfield began disappearing. The one that changed everything was Bernice Worden, the local hardware store owner. On November 16, 1957, her son, who happened to be a deputy sheriff, found blood on the floor and a sales slip made out to Ed Gein. Police went to his farmhouse. What they found still shocks the world. Inside were human remains, repurposed into objects no one should ever see. A lampshade, belts, masks. Investigators discovered Bernice's body hanging in a shed, mutilated like a hunted animal. Ed confessed to killing Bernice and another woman, tavern owner Mary Hogan, who had vanished 3 years earlier. But most of the remains in his home weren't murder victims. They came from graves he robbed. He admitted to digging up bodies of women who reminded him of his mother. Police reopened graves and found them disturbed, proving his story true. He was declared insane, later judged competent, and convicted of Bernice Worden's murder. He would spend the rest of his life in a state hospital until his death in 1984. So far, that's the real story. Now let's talk about the Netflix version and why it feels so different. Here's the first thing to know. Monster. The Ed Gein story was never meant to be a documentary. It doesn't claim to tell the true crimes of Ed Gein. It's based on the lore, the mythology that grew around him, the cultural shadow he cast over horror itself. Ryan Murphy's team said from the start that this season explores how one man's legend reshaped what we think of as American horror. That's important, because lore isn't history. It's the story we tell after the facts stop satisfying us. Still, even knowing that, the show takes enormous liberties. One researcher who literally wrote the book on Ed Gein said about 90% of it is inaccurate. Yes, Gein was a loner obsessed with his mother who killed 2 women. But almost everything beyond that, his sexual motives, secret romances, and FBI ties, is fiction. The series paints him as a sadistic killer, a man who tortures for pleasure. In reality, he wasn't a lust murderer. He shot both victims quickly. There was no evidence of torture or assault. His horror began after death, not before it. His goal wasn't cruelty, it was delusion. He wanted, somehow, to bring his mother back. When he couldn't dig up her coffin, he turned to nearby graves of women who looked like her, collecting pieces to reconstruct what he'd lost. It's morbid, yes, but in his twisted logic it was about resurrection, not dominance. The show blurs. That line, turning him into a symbolic monster of desire and death. And while that makes gripping television, it isn't factual. Let's look at some of the biggest myths. First, the necrophilia. Netflix shows a shocking scene implying sexual acts with corpses. That's never been proven, not even hinted at reliably in police files. Ed himself denied it, and investigators found no evidence. He wanted to use the bodies, not violate them. Second, the babysitter scenes. In the show, Gein is creepy around kids. In real life, he actually babysat for families in town. People saw him as a bit slow, maybe strange, but gentle. He related better to children than adults, and there's no record of him ever harming one. Then there's Bernice Worden. On screen, she becomes almost a romantic figure. Lonely widow, secret connection, tragic dance with death. In truth, Bernice barely knew him beyond her store counter. Gein once asked her to go roller skating, but that was it. Her family later said they were devastated by how Netflix turned her into a love interest. The show adds another character, Adeline Watkins, a waitress who supposedly falls for him. There really was a woman named Adeline Watkins in Plainfield, but her relationship with Ed existed only in her imagination and later in the tabloids. She admitted she made it up after reporters arrived. Next, the link to the missing teenager Evelyn Hartley. The series hints that Gein might be connected to her disappearance. Police did wonder the same thing back in 1957, but they found zero evidence. Evelyn's case remains unsolved, and Gein was never tied to it. Netflix also dramatizes the death of Gein's brother Henry, showing Ed striking him in rage. That, too, is creative writing. Henry died in a brush fire accident, likely from smoke inhalation or a heart attack. Ed was questioned, yes, but never charged, and investigators didn't find a single sign of foul play. Toward the end, the show dives into fantasy, Gein dreaming, hallucinating, or imagining violent acts. Viewers see scenes that never happened, sometimes blending his thoughts with real events. That's deliberate. The creators wanted to show how the idea of Gein became bigger than his actual life. But for anyone chasing facts, those sequences are pure symbolism. And then there's the wildest twist, Gein consulting the FBI on the Ted Bundy case. Timelines alone make that impossible. Bundy's crimes happened decades later, and Gein spent his life confined. It's metaphor, not memory. A way to show how the shadow of Gein stretched into later horrors. So what's left when we strip away the fiction? 2 murders, a series of grave robberies, a man consumed by grief and madness. That's all, and somehow, that was enough to change horror forever. Let's talk about why. Before Psycho, monsters came from far-off lands. Dracula from Transylvania, the Mummy from Egypt, the Wolfman from London. But in 1959, horror writer Robert Bloch used Ed Gein's story as the seed for Psycho. Suddenly, the monster lived next door. Norman Bates was polite, shy, American, and terrifyingly ordinary. Alfred Hitchcock turned that book into a masterpiece, and the world never looked at the quiet man next door the same way again. From there came the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, American Horror Story, all drawing pieces from the Gein myth. He became less a criminal and more a cultural template. The man who made horror American, that's the version Ryan Murphy's show explores, the mythology, not the police files. And in that sense, Monster succeeds. It shows how one man's obsession created an entire genre, even if most of its plotlines never happened. But that raises a harder question. When true crime turns into entertainment, do we remember the victims, or do we just remember the monster? Bernice Worden wasn't a character. She was a real woman, with a son who had to walk into that store and find blood on the floor. Mary Hogan was a tavern owner with friends who still missed her. For them, this isn't lore. It's life rewritten for ratings. So maybe the real story of Ed Gein isn't about how he killed, but about how we kept resurrecting him. Every book, Every movie, every series like Monster adds another layer of legend until the truth almost disappears. And maybe that's the real horror here, how tragedy becomes myth, and myth becomes entertainment. Ed Gein wasn't a serial killer in the modern sense. He didn't stalk dozens of victims. He didn't hunt for pleasure. He was a lonely man who crossed every moral line trying to replace what he'd lost. A man destroyed by his own delusion. Hollywood turned that into a story we can't stop retelling. So the next time someone asks if Monster is accurate, the honest answer might be yes and no. It's true to the legend of Ed Gein, but not to his crimes. It's not about the facts of Plainfield, it's about the echoes that still haunt American horror, and that's what makes this case different. The crime ended in 1957, but the story never did. It keeps coming back every time we press play. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe if you want more true crime without the Hollywood smoke. See you in the next case.